Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeremy McCall. I'm the Client Services Manager for Epilepsy Support Center. We provide support, education, and advocacy services to individuals living with seizure disorders in a region stretching from Oxford County all the way down to Windsor and Sarnia. As many of you likely know, March is Epilepsy Awareness Month. 1 in 10 Canadians will have a seizure at some point in their life, and 1 in 100 Canadians will be diagnosed with epilepsy. Epilepsy is the second most expensive neurological condition to treat in Canada, and individuals who live with epilepsy often do so shrouded in stigma and marginalization. March is our opportunity for individuals to let their voices be heard and to educate the public about epilepsy and seizure disorders. For further information, please consult our website, which is open on your screen. Today, we hoped to present a webinar as part of the Year of the Brain 2015 initiative that would resonate with anyone that signed up and provide useful information to any individual living with a neurological condition. One of the most common frustrations we hear from our clients involves issues with their memory, and this can be a struggle for a number of individuals diagnosed with other neurological conditions as well. With our head office being located in London, we are fortunate to be minutes away from the biggest epilepsy monitoring unit in Canada, which employs a number of world-renowned individuals in the field of epilepsy. One of those individuals is Dr. Brent Hayman-Abello. Dr. Brent Hayman-Abello is a clinical neuropsychologist at London Health Sciences Centre Epilepsy Program. As part of the epilepsy team there, he works with patients and their families looking at their thinking abilities and possible changes in thinking associated with epilepsy and its treatment. Before that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Baycrest Center in Toronto, working on memory in aging and strategies for memory difficulties. Today, Brent's presentation will teach us all some valuable memory strategies for individuals with neurological disorders. At this point, I will turn it over to him.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I'm just going to get my presentation ready to go here. All right, hopefully everybody can see that okay. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jeremy. And so as he explained, I'm going to be talking about memory. I'm going to be talking about, first, an overview of memory in general, how it takes place in its different aspects and forms. I'm going to talk a little bit about different conditions and factors that can affect people's memory functioning, both negative and positive, and both normal and abnormal or injury disease-related issues affecting memory. And then I'll spend the remainder of the presentation talking about different strategies that people can use to try to work around memory difficulties and compensate for any problems they might be having. And I'll try to make sure that I get through this in a reasonable time so that we still have time for questions at the end. So first of all, most people are probably very familiar with the concept of memory, and knowing that we have a lot of healthcare professionals in here, that helps to know that I won't probably be saying too many things that people aren't already familiar with. But in general, memory is thought to be a fairly easy, straightforward kind of concept, and in many ways it is, but other times it gets a little bit complicated when you get into the details. Almost everybody can say, oh sure, I know what memory is, it's something or other, but when you really get into the nitty-gritty, sometimes it gets a bit confusing. For instance, is memory just the act of learning and memorizing some information? Or is it an actual thing that we have? I have a memory of what I did this morning before getting ready for the seminar. I have a memory of what happened last summer on a trip that we took. Or is it the actual retrieval of information? Is it remembering what we really call memory, pulling things out? So how you want to talk about memory can get a little bit complicated when you get to that level. And when people are having a problem with memory, that also can happen in many different ways. And one person's memory difficulty might actually be a little bit different than someone else's, and some strategies are going to be more or less helpful for different people depending on what kind of memory difficulties they're having. So I just want to go and jump right in and say what I think to be a fairly useful working definition of what I'm going to refer to as memory, and it's kind of cheating by saying all those things I just mentioned. I'm going to say that memory is a process by which we learn, retain or store, and recall information. So it's all those things that I talked about. It's the thing, the storage, the keeping. And in many professions, including psychology, we're not satisfied with using basic terms. We always have to have something that sounds a little more scientific so we can get our papers published. And in a lot of scientific and psychology journals you read, people use different terms. So learning is often called encoding or acquisition of memory, and retaining is storage or retention, and then recall is sometimes called retrieval. So when I talk about those terms, I might use them interchangeably as we go here. And if you want to think about it, those three terms again, they're sort of in a sequence of activity that have to take place. For us to form memory, first we have to encode it. We have to have it come into the spot where we get the information in the first place. We have to store it in there, have it accessible for later on, and then we have to be able to retrieve it. And a breakdown in any one of these processes or the connections between them can result in a memory problem. If the information never gets encoded, we're not going to be able to store it or retrieve it. If the information gets in but then fades away, it's not going to be there for retrieval later on, and so on. And one thing that I didn't mention yet, but is actually very important for the memory process, is a little thing called attention. Encoding is really importantly relying on the basis of our attentional abilities. If we aren't able to attend to something, if we aren't able to focus on the information or have it get in the first place, we're never even going to get to this aspect of memory. Now, attention is often treated separately and differently than memory, partly because it works differently and partly because it tends to involve some other brain areas, but it's a really important part of any memory process, and memory can't really happen without some form of attention at some point. So back to this working definition, memory is how we learn, retain, and recall information. And how memory works relies on both certain brain structures, some more than others, as well as the communication between those brain structures. Now, our brain's made up of neurons, and neurons have all these connections between them, but certain clusters and areas of neurons in the brain are more particularly important for memory than others. And although I have this one working definition, there's a lot of different types or kinds of memory that people have and that can be referred to, and in some cases, different parts of the brain are involved in those different kinds of memory. So just briefly, I'll go over what are some major types. This is not a complete or exhaustive list, but it's some of the major ones that people often refer to and use in research and in their daily life. So first of all, we have something that you can call immediate memory. This is really what some people might think of as short-term memory, but it's even shorter than that. It's memory for just the last few seconds or so. It's sort of being able to remember what I said at the beginning of this sentence, or if someone reads you off a phone number, the few seconds you have to repeat that right back to them. Very short, very fast. In some ways, it's almost more of a factor of attention than it is memory itself. Then there's short-term or recent memory, and this is different than that immediate memory in that it's something that tends to last more than just that brief few seconds. It can be lasting a few minutes or even a few hours, maybe even a day or so. That is not quite permanent long-term memory, but it's still there. So it's your ability to remember, as I said, what I was doing this morning before I came in. It's your ability to remember, what you had for dinner last night or something. That may not be stored in your permanent memory for the rest of your life, but it's going to be there for a little while. So it's kind of short-term or recent memory. Some people prefer the term recent memory to make sure that people don't mix it up with that immediate brief seconds duration of memory. And then we have long-term memory. This is our permanent memory storage for things that we have in our brains that we're going to have for many, many years to come, and where a lot of that storage, retention, and retrieval stuff is taking place for the long term. And long-term memory itself can actually be broken up into several different parts as well. Again, I'm only going to talk about a few of them here. One of the major distinctions in long-term memory is what we call explicit and implicit, or what you can think of as sort of conscious and non-conscious memory. Explicit memory is further broken down into semantic memory, which is a memory for facts and information like that, not tied to any particular time or episode in our life, and then episodic memory, which is very personal and very context-based. So semantic memory is information that we have that we don't necessarily remember where we learned it, but we have it in there. So our ability to define certain words, our actual memory of language and things like that. Your times tables, you might be able to remember how a lot of different numbers multiplied by each other get a certain outcome. You don't remember doing your times tables, but you don't necessarily remember the time that you learned every single one of those. You might have certain historical facts, when Canada was founded in 1867, but you don't necessarily know where you learned that. Now, some people do remember that, and that's where episodic memory comes in. This is our personal information that we know we can tie to a specific time and place. It's, if you remember the first time you heard about Confederation of Canada, it's your memory for your wedding day. It's memory for, your 30th birthday party or something like that. It's context-based, it's tied to yourself, it's tied to a certain time, there's lots of emotions often tied to it, or a lot of specific details. Within episodic memory, people sometimes also refer to really long-term memory called remote memory. So, things from way, way back in our early childhood, many, many, many years ago. Autobiographical memory is often treated differently as well because that's very personally based. That's your own life story. So as I mentioned before, your wedding day, birthday parties, your child's first music recital, things like that. You remember these things and they're part of your personal life story. They're part of your episodic memory and they're separate from that semantic, factual only, context-free kind of memory. Implicit or non-conscious memory is our ability to remember information, to form and learn things and retrieve them later on without specifically even being aware that we're learning it or unable to really articulate it or put it out there in a formal way. So a lot of things that you might call procedural memory, your ability to drive a car or ride a bike or tie your shoelaces, things that you know how to do. Some people might think of it as muscle memory. You've learned it, it's ingrained in you, you can do it when needed, but you find that it's sometimes hard to know exactly when you learned it to the degree that you did. You might remember the first time you tried driving or the first time you tried to tie your shoes. Some things are easier to articulate, but when you try to tell somebody, how do you keep your balance on your bike? You just sort of do it. How do you form words when you're doing handwriting? You can do that, but you don't think about it too much while you're doing it usually. Certain habits are like this, certain trained reflexes, like not a blink reflex, but a reflexive action if somebody has been highly trained in athletic activities or in the military or something, and there's certain moves that they don't think about that they've learned and they can produce instantly without actually having to consciously recall them into memory. That's the kind of thing we talk about when we refer to implicit, explicit memory. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about for that. As I said, there's lots of other things you can talk about, lots of other kinds of memory, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to go on to some of the rest of the talk here. Now, as the poll showed, there's a lot of healthcare professionals in here. I usually try to keep the anatomy of memory to a minimum, and I still will, but bear with me for those of you that are not that keen on anatomy. It's not going to get too graphic here, and it's not going to get too in-depth. As I said before, there's many different parts of the brain that can be involved in different kinds of memory. Most types will involve multiple parts of the brain. And for instance, our long-term memories are not stored in any one small spot in our brain. Somehow the network of all the connections of different parts of our brain seem to be involved in our ability to retain and store that long-term information. Recent memory, though, and especially our ability to form and create new memories, tends to really rely on certain structures more than other. And very crucially, most recent memory or new memory formation is relying on an area called the hippocampus. It's a small little area of dense neurons right in the middle of what's called our temporal lobe. It's the part of our brain that's right beside our temples, just sort of above and behind and inside of our ears on each side, one on either side. So I'm going to throw up a quick little cartoon image of the brain here. This is looking at the brain from the left-hand side here. I don't know if you can see my mouse on here, but this is the front and this is the back. Your eyes would be around here somewhere. This is called the cerebellum, really important for balance, coordination, but a lot of research in the last few years has shown that it's involved possibly in memory and learning as well. And this is the temporal lobe that I'm talking about in here. It's this long piece all in this way. Just for reference, this would be the frontal lobe, being at the front. This part back here is called the occipital lobe. It's very important in vision. And up here we have the parietal lobe, and it involves our ability to move as well as our sensation and associating a lot of information. So inside this temporal lobe here, this is the outside surface. Inside of there is a little area called the hippocampus. It's right around in that area. This is not a perfect anatomical drawing, don't get me wrong. This is just to give an idea of where we're talking about in here. So it takes up a lot of that temporal lobe, goes almost all the way to the end and almost all the way to the back here. And it's where a lot of crucial learning and ability to form new memories takes place. And I'll be referring to this structure a lot as we go on here to talk about different things and how they affect memory. But that's most of the anatomy I'm going to be focusing on. So what are some different factors that can affect memory? What can cause our memory to have problems, to work less well than it used to, and what are also some factors that can sometimes improve and help our memory beyond the strategies that I'm going to go on to later on. So there's several things here. I'm going to go through them one at a time over the next few minutes here. First of all, age. One of the biggest risk factors for developing a change in your memory is age. A slight decline in particularly our recent memory is perfectly normal. Unfortunately, it happens to just about all of us. There's the rare person that maybe doesn't really have this happen, but the most common thing is that around our late 40s, early 50s, particularly, maybe even a little bit earlier, we will see very minor, slight changes in our recent memory. We tend to be a little bit more forgetful of day-to-day things. We tend to forget something we already did or talked to somebody about. We tend to misplace things a little more often. It's perfectly normal. We know this because when they're doing memory research and when they're creating memory tests and they want to say, okay, what's the average performance for different people? We find that normal, perfectly healthy, functioning individuals, their recent memory tends not to be as great as it is for people in their 20s once they get into their 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. It doesn't mean that you're having severe memory problems. That's not normal, but a slight worsening of everyday memory, perfectly normal, perfectly common. Not something to get too worked up about. And these are often the easiest to work around. A lot of the strategies that I'm going to be talking about here are very applicable to people that are having this normal, age-related, mild memory changes. Now, abnormal changes in memory can come about from a number of different medical conditions or ways that the brain gets injured. I'm going to talk about these in a little more detail, each one of them. Some of them are going to be things that people are well familiar with already, and again, given the time that I have here, it's not going to be a chance for me to go through all these things in detail, but I want to give a brief overview of each one as we're going. And the one thing to keep in mind while I'm going through this is that memory can be affected in each of these conditions, but it's not always affected. Sometimes people can have the same exact sounding condition and they will not have a change in their memory, whereas other people will. The exception, of course, being dementia conditions. Dementia, by definition, involves changes in memory. Well, by most definitions, there's some changes now in the end that people suggest you don't necessarily have to have memory changes to be a dementia, and certain kinds of dementia, memory changes aren't even the first thing that you'll see. It'll happen later on. But for the rest of them, memory is not always affected. But in things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, they're usually defined, especially Alzheimer's, by a change in memory. So let's first off talk about changes in epilepsy. This is a very commonly reported concern or problem by people that have epilepsy. Not everyone that has epilepsy has a memory problem, but it tends to be reported very frequently as a concern by people with epilepsy, along with things like fear of having an unexpected seizure, concerns about driving ability. Memory tends to be right up there. And like I was saying before about memory changes, people who have memory changes due to epilepsy can also have them take place in a variety of ways. The changes that occur can be in many different forms. Some ways that epilepsy can affect memory directly are, for instance, seizures themselves. If people have a seizure that causes them to lose consciousness or lose awareness in touch with their environment, then they're not able to form new memories at that time often. Or if they do, they fade away very quickly. So people who have a seizure, particularly if that seizure involves the hippocampus, even if they don't necessarily lose consciousness, they may lose a few minutes or even hours of memory, but usually a few seconds or minutes is more common during the seizure itself. Now, there's many types of seizures that don't affect memory, many types of seizures that people's consciousness is not in any way affected, but for those that are, memory is a common outcome. It's also possible for people with epilepsy to have their thinking abilities and their memory functions disrupted by epileptic activity between seizures. Now, epilepsy is defined by, recurrence of seizures, but people that are having recurrent seizures, people that have epilepsy, can also have some unusual patterns of brain firing, even that aren't associated with seizures, that don't even have a noticeable effect on their day-to-day life. They wouldn't even know they're having them unless they were hooked up to an EEG recording machine. In some cases, if those are happening a lot, in particular if they're happening in the hippocampus areas and the temporal lobe, that might affect day-to-day memory as well in a more consistent, continuous kind of fashion. And then finally, a lot of people with epilepsy, particularly who have epilepsy from the temporal lobes, if they have a focal type of epilepsy, will sometimes have some scarring or damage to brain tissue right in and around that hippocampus area. It's still not entirely clear about where that scar tissue comes from, if it forms from something which then causes seizures, or if recurrent seizures causes that scar tissue to form. There's evidence on each side, but often people that have scarring in that hippocampal area will frequently have problems with memory. Again, never say never. It doesn't always happen to every single person, but it's much more commonly seen in those situations. Stroke is another way that people can have a neurological condition affect their brain. It particularly is occurring if people have a stroke in the hippocampus, but people can also have memory problems if they have strokes in other areas. So for instance, if they have a number of scattered small strokes in a lot of parts of the brain, that can interfere with communication and the ability for different crucial memory portions of the brain to talk to each other, to retrieve memories, and to get information back into conscious recall. People that have strokes in the frontal part of their brain, that can also result in certain changes in cognitive ability and thinking abilities that will disrupt memory as well. But again, people can also have strokes in other parts of the brain that don't have any effect on memory, but very often if the stroke occurs in the temporal lobes or in areas that have strong connections to the temporal lobes, memory is often going to be seen to be affected there. It can also have memory changes with other kinds of brain injury. Technically, a stroke is a brain injury. It's just caused by blood flow problems in the brain. So people often categorize these separately. But a brain injury from other causes, say from an injury, a trauma, a closed head injury, or traumatic brain injury, or if they have an infection that damages a certain part of the brain, again, likely the hippocampus or the temporal lobe, those will often affect people's thinking and memory abilities as well. And sometimes the injury to the brain can be not right beside where the injury to the head occurred. If somebody's hit on the right side of their head, if it's a hard enough blow or circumstances are just right, they might have injury to the inside part of their brain on the opposite side, and that can cause different kinds of memory problems. Again, it varies very much between individuals, and whether there's a memory change and how much will depend very much on the location of the brain injury itself. Dementia, or what's now in the new classification of the Psychiatrist Manual of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, they're calling neurocognitive disorders, but dementia is still a very common medical term. This is a condition where people develop a gradually worsening problem in their thinking abilities, always or most often including memory and often some other aspect of their thinking, and to the point that it interferes with their daily social or occupational functioning. The most common type of dementia that people often refer to is Alzheimer's disease, and is the most common type of dementia, but other common types of dementia can come about. Some people with Parkinson's disease can develop a dementia. There's something called vascular dementia, where several strokes or one large stroke can cause memory problems. There's other more obscure types of dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, which is made up of other things, semantic dementia. Those can be associated with memory problems as well, but in those cases, sometimes you won't see memory problems right away. There'll be other changes, problems in attention and concentration, problems in personality, or changes in personality, I should say, and then memory later on. Now, when I talk about dementia, the biggest risk factor for developing this kind of thing is aging. You're at a higher risk the older you are, but I want to emphasize that dementia is not a normal part of aging. It's still an unusual occurrence. The majority of people who are old, even the oldest old in the 80s and 90s, not everybody will always get dementia. But the older you are, the greater risk that people will have this. Still, hopefully none of you will have that. When you have dementia changes, it's often a slow, kind of gradual onset, and then it changes and worsens over time. The kinds of memory problems you see will differ by the condition to a certain degree. So for instance, people with Alzheimer's dementia will have a lot of trouble forming new memory, and what gets in tends to fade away quickly, and it's very hard to learn new information from day to day. Other types of dementia, say for instance from Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease, they might look like they have the same kind of memory problem, but they will actually have the information get in, they just can't get to it. So it's more a problem of getting the information, retrieving the information. So neurolearning can occur, but then they have trouble getting to it without hints or help. People with significant Alzheimer's disease, many hints in that will not be helpful to them. So the kinds of memory changes you see with dementia will vary and be different depending on the kind of condition that people have. So moving away from specific medical conditions, there are other factors that can affect memory as well that are related to medicine, medical care I should say. So certain medications. My work, of course, being in epilepsy, I see this a lot. There are some anti-seizure medications that have known side effects in some people of causing thinking abilities, particularly in memory and attention. This tends to be more often in older antidepressants. Some of the newer ones, and a lot of the newer ones, tend not to have this kind of effect, but phenobarbital is a very commonly reported drug that will affect memory and thinking abilities. Sometimes Tegretol has been associated with that. More modern medicine, there's one called topiramate or Topamax that in some people can have a very predictable effect on memory, particularly attention and memory for words and things like that, a lot of word finding problems. It doesn't affect everyone, only affects one proportion of people who use that medication, but for those who it does affect, it tends to follow a fairly predictable pattern. You can also sometimes see memory problems in people who are taking certain antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. Again, it tends to be not so much of a problem with more modern medications. In the past, there had been some research that showed Elavil was associated with worsening problems in some people, particularly in older adults who are taking it. The good news about this kind of memory change, though, is that these effects are often either temporary or reversible. Sometimes the changes in memory are a bit of a side effect, and they can be stopped and even reversed if the amount of the medication is changed, or if the medication is stopped entirely and a new one is put in there. If the memory changes are specifically due to medication side effects, they will tend to go away when the medication is changed in some way. So now I've been talking a lot about things that can have negative effects on memory. I'm going to talk about some things that can have positive or negative effects depending. Diet and exercise. In general, lots of research has shown that with better nutrition and better health, you tend to see better memory functioning, particularly as we get older. Often you'll see better memory in people that are getting adequate intake of vitamins and minerals, and it turns out our mothers and our grandmothers were right all along. Our bodies are best at processing vitamins and minerals that come in through naturally occurring foods, vegetables, fruits, and all that sort of thing. Taking vitamin pills is still good and fine. I'm not saying don't do that, but it turns out that we all should be eating our vegetables as much as we can. People that have lower fat and cholesterol levels in their body, or at least not excessive levels, tend to have better cognitive thinking abilities, including memory. And there's some research that people who are obese or notably overweight can tend to have more difficulties with memory. There's been even some recent research out of England showing that people specifically with epilepsy who are also overweight, it's been associated with worse memory functioning than if they're not overweight. So I'm one of the people that definitely can lose some weight, but in general, healthier lifestyle, better thinking for most people. Not a cure-all, but in the long run, it's better to do that if you can. There's also evidence that exercise can be helpful, and in fact, doing a short amount of moderate exercise can have a brief boost on people's memory. If somebody sits on a treadmill and does 15 minutes of walking very quickly and then gets off and right away does some challenging task, the abilities can be improved a little bit. Maybe because the blood flow is going or the adrenaline or something, but it's not a permanent kind of effect. However, keeping in shape, getting regular exercise and all that is associated with better health, which is associated with better functioning in general, and particularly as we get older. So as we get close to the end of this part here, I want to talk about a couple other factors here. Mood can also affect our memory. People who are feeling sad and down, they will sometimes have worse memory. People who are overly nervous and anxious can also have problems in their memory. And another factor that can affect memory is stress. Now, when I talk about stress, it can be positive or negative. Most people, when they think about stress, they think about, oh, I'm all stressed about work or stressed about getting somewhere or all these pressures. But even positive things can cause stress. You know, planning a wedding for somebody or getting excited about a big trip somewhere. That can be very stressful as well, even though it's a positive, exciting thing. The big thing about stress, of course, is that a small amount for a brief time can help. Kind of like the exercise. It energizes you a little bit, gets you going. But high levels of stress for a prolonged period of time can result in worse memory, and that can just be a constant ongoing problem as you go, and sometimes worsen stress in and of itself. Now, much like with the medication, the nice thing about this is that if people are having memory problems just due to mood issues or high continuous levels of stress, they are usually reversible. Once you get the stress taken care of, once you're able to cope with the mood and your mood improves, the memory performance tends to improve as well. Now, speaking of that, one way to deal with stress and sometimes depression or anxiety is through relaxation. In general, you should just do whatever you like. Things that you find enjoyable, being in comfortable places, that's what's going to be helpful. You can also do formal techniques. You know, you can do controlled muscle relaxation. Some people like meditation. Some people really like yoga or deep breathing or something. I never specifically recommend things like yoga or deep breathing or something because depending on what kind of medical condition people have, that might not be a good idea. And people that have seizures, if you do breathing in a funny way for too long, that can result in causing seizures as well. So I tend to focus on these kinds of things alone. The main thing, of course, is to make sure that you do things that you like. Now, one last thing I'm going to mention here is things that can affect memory are brain activating activities or just getting your thinking going. So a lot of people say, well, is memory like a muscle? It's a mental muscle. If I practice it, I'll get good at it. Is that something I should do? I should be doing memory exercises to improve my memory. Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, in that if you don't use your brain, if you don't keep it active, then yeah, you might not do very well. There's a real kind of use it or lose it quality to a lot of thinking abilities. But practicing a specific activity does not make you generally better. It's not exactly like if you lift a lot of weights, then you can lift anything else. If you practice one technique, you'll get really good at that technique. You won't necessarily be good at doing it everywhere else. If you sit down and practice memorizing lists of words, you're not going to have a perfect memory for everything. You might get good at memorizing word lists, but that's about it. I used to use the example of Sudoku when it was very popular. People can do Sudoku over and over and over again. You get really good at Sudoku, but you wouldn't become a math genius. So it's good to practice things and use your brain, but we find that doing different techniques and activities makes you good at those techniques, not generally good at memory. And that's why when I talk about memory strategies, I tend to focus more on doing things that are workaround strategies. So what kind of things should people do? Just anything that stimulates your thinking regularly. Ongoing learning, reading, listening to music, traveling, doing puzzles and games, volunteering, socializing and talking to people. Things that you enjoy that get you thinking and doing things are going to help. Now, I realize I'm running short on time here, so I'm going to just jump ahead really quickly and talk about some memory strategies. And one thing I want to mention is that these are workarounds. These are tools. They're used for common everyday memory mistakes, so people with no real memory problems or people with significant memory problems can possibly still benefit from them. Different techniques are going to be more useful for different people, and so I want to emphasize that people should use what works best for them and not expect that every one of these is just equally good for everyone. You have to pick and choose. So these are the ones I'm going to talk about briefly. I'll just leave them up here, and I'm not going to go through them as we're running short on time here. I want to make sure I leave some time for questions at the end. That might only be 10 minutes rather than 15, but I'll do my best here. So formal mnemonics are memory strategies that use specific techniques different than the other ones I'm going to talk about. These are ones that have been developed by experts or scientists or that use learning a specific memory trick to try to work around your memory problem. One's called the method of loci. If you have a list of information to remember or a list of things to do, you can sort of imagine a route from walking around your neighborhood or walking around your house, and you tie things to it. Like if you want to go to the grocery store, okay, when I walk out of my bedroom, I want to remember your shopping list. I walk out of my bedroom, and the first thing I see on my right-hand side is my lamp on the table. Okay, the lamp reminds me of light. I got to get light bulbs. And the table has a drawer in it, and I remember the drawer has pens and paper. I need to pick up a pad of paper. And then beside the table is a chair, and I want to sit down, and oh yeah, that reminds me that I got to get shoe polish, because I sit down and I look at my feet, and I see, it can be as elaborate or detailed as complicated as you like. Another one is the peg word method, where you use a series of rhymes. 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door. Again, it's used for memorizing lists. You want to memorize that shopping list. 1 is a bun. Oh yeah, I think of a bun. I'm going to get bread. 2 is a shoe. I'm going to walk outside. I remember to get shoe polish. 3 is a tree. Oh, I need to get milk. I imagine a tree that's covered in milk bottles or something. I tend not to recommend these methods to everyone because in some ways they're more complicated to learn than the memory problem you're having itself. And it gives you 2 new things you have to remember. You have to memorize these roots or memorize this list of 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe. And some people find it more frustrating than helpful. But people that like it, they really swear by it, think it's really helpful. Most of the strategies that I tend to focus on and recommend are more everyday workaround things. So one thing I mentioned at the beginning is focusing your attention. So whether or not you have a memory problem, sometimes if you have difficulty with memory more because you find it difficult to focus, certain types of dementia, damage to the frontal lobes of the brain, often associated more with attention problems than memory per se. And so when you want to learn new information, focus on what you need to know. Be choosy. Don't try to remember every single thing. Know that some things are more important than others and focus on those. When you know you have an important learning task, whether you're studying for a test or if you're doing anything that demands a lot of thinking abilities, filling out some forms, talking to your doctor on the phone, reduce distractions. Turn off the television or the radio. Have people be quiet. Close the door to the room. If you're working on something at a table, clear off the table. Try not to have even visual distractions in there. Focus your attention and make your environment help you focus your attention. And try not to multitask so much. A lot of times people, they're trying to do multiple things at once, but often it just means you're giving less attention to each one of those things. And you may end up taking longer than if you just focused all your attention on one thing at a time. Now, obviously, you can do certain things like talk on the phone while you're making dinner or something, but sometimes you might also get distracted and not hear some important piece of information because you're trying to get something out of the cupboard. Or somebody might tell you something really important and then the stove boils over. So in general, I tend to recommend to people, maybe don't focus so much on multitasking. Maybe try to do just one thing at a time. Another kind of memory tip is what I call talking through. Other people call talk around strategies. This is very helpful for people that are having word finding problems. A very common report of people with thinking changes is that they are having more trouble coming up with the right word when they're talking about something. I was supposed to go to the the hardware store, because I was writing out of glue. I needed glue, special glue for this project I'm working on. It's there. You have the information. It might come to you within seconds. It might come to you hours or even days later. Very frustrating. Not so much a memory problem, but it feels just like one. It's more of a language problem. In any case, it is frustrating. When you're having these kinds of things happen to you, a good strategy is to talk around the word, to describe, to define the word you're trying to come up with, say words that are related to it, either in your head or out loud. When you're talking to people, they might be able to fill it in for you and answer it for you. So, for instance, that example I gave of the hardware store, I have to go to the, that place where you buy lots of tools and things for building and repairing stuff and all that. And, oh, thank you, yes, the hardware store. I promise you, there's not a person in the world that I can think of that has not had this happen to them at least sometimes in their life. And everybody can relate to it. They're not going to think that much less of you or anything if you say, what is that word? And they say, oh yeah, I do that all the time too. So let others help. And by talking about those words and trying to find them out loud, they can jump in and help you. Another way to improve your memory is to add some context, some meaning to the information. Make it stand out, elaborate on it somehow, tie it to something that you know, or try to make it stand out in an odd way. Really think about it and put it deep down into your memory. It's very helpful for especially remembering things like names, things like that. A visual image that's unusual will help get that information in there. So for instance, my name is Hayman-Abello. It's a long, busy name to try to remember, but if you really wanted to remember it for the rest of your life, maybe you might think of some odd image, like picture a guy standing on top of a big pile of straw or hay, and maybe he's ringing a bell. Hayman-Abello. Oh, Hayman-Abello. Or, you know, a guy standing on a pile of hay and yelling, oh, Hayman-Abello. He's a bellowing on there. So, you know, the more crazy, the more unusual, the better. That's, you know, I use my name as an example. There's lots of ways you can do it. Again, be choosy though. Pick the things that you want to remember, and if it's important, try to think of some odd way to do it. You can also use this technique, then probably many of us have, when you're trying to learn things. For instance, certain rhymes and things we learned in school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You might have used that rhyme. You may not remember where you learned that rhyme. Columbus came to North America in 1492. It's kind of semantic memory, but if that was something you wanted, you could put it in there. People that, when you're learning music sometimes, especially children, they talk about learning the different notes on a staff. So the spaces spell out face, F-A-C-E, and notes on the lines are E-G, B, D, F. Every good boy deserves fudge, or every good boy does fine. Those are tricks. Those are adding meaningful context to it that then ties back to your memory in your head so you can get it out later on. I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember CBC Radio. Years ago, they used to have a show called Basic Black on Saturday mornings, and they would, when people still used good old regular paper mail and sent things by that, they would ram off their postal code. And instead of just saying the numbers, M5B1E6, they'd often say, make 5 wieners, I'll eat 6. And that, you know, it's a crazy, silly phrase, but it adds context, it adds meaning, it makes you think about the information more. And that's really what this technique is about. Adding meaningful context, forcing you to do a deeper level of processing for information that you want to remember. You can also do something where you look for patterns called chunking. So instead of memorizing a whole bunch of things, look for patterns in the words, especially good for memorizing phone numbers. So for instance, if you wanted to call the Epilepsy Support Center in London, you could dial 519-433-4073. That's, you know, a lot of numbers to remember, but if you just had to remember 519-433-4073, that's fewer numbers to remember. It's the exact same number of digits, but in our mind, it's fewer numbers. Instead of 7 numbers, now it's only like 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, 5 or 6 numbers instead of 10. And that will help you remember things you want to keep in your memory and recall later on. Another really helpful thing to do with memory is organize. This is really helpful if you're constantly misplacing items around your house. You know, where are my keys? Where are my glasses? Where's my wallet? Where's my purse? Very helpful in ways to do that. Best way to work around this is to find set logical places for those frequently misplaced items. You know, it's like that old saying, a place for everything and everything in its place. Choose things that you tend to lose a lot and have a set place for them. My keys, if they're not in my hand, then they're in this coat pocket of the right-hand pocket of my coat, or they're in this bowl in the kitchen, they're on this hook by the back door. Those are the only places they can be. You know, you come in, the phone's ringing, you might throw your keys down, put the groceries down, go to the phone. Don't do that. Make sure that your keys are either in your hand or in their spot. Same thing with your wallet. It's good for your medicine. It's good for anything at all. Bills, when they come in, should go in a certain spot. Don't just toss them away so you don't lose them. The important thing for this, of course, too, is to use this in moderation. You don't want to have every single thing in your entire house in a specific set place. Be choosy. Pick the things that you tend to misplace, the things that are really important. Have those be set places. If you want to have one specific spot for every single thing in your house and no one can move anything else, that's a different kind of condition. That's beyond memory problems that you can talk to another kind of psychologist about. For now, though, if you're having misplacing problems, this is a really helpful technique. And this organization can actually help for other things too. When you're writing lists, when you're writing shopping lists, you can organize them by category or by place in the grocery store. And by rewriting your shopping list that way, you're actually extra contextualizing it, adding some meaning, and you might not forget things if you forget your list. Doing your to-do list, you can organize them by the order in which you do them or order of importance or something. Organization can apply in a lot of ways. And now quickly, I'll just run through a couple more things here. written reminders. This is one of the most important and useful strategies I think I can mention to people here because it's used by so many people already. You want to remember something? Write it down. The important thing with this is I say, if you're going to use this, try to write things down on something that you'll have with you. Write it on your calendar by your phone is great. Write it on a big pad of paper you have at home. That can be great, but if you're out and about doing things, doctor calls, changes your appointment, and then you're out doing things, you might not remember about that change. It's better if you can take things with you. So again, the organization comes in there as well. Having a bunch of Post-it notes or just a small pad that you write things on and cross it off as you go, that can be great, but why not have something that has a built-in calendar, has a built-in to-do list, has a built-in set of address and phone number options that you can put in there. You can get paper ones or you can get electronic ones. Anybody that has a modern smartphone now is going to have all these things built in there already. You don't even have to download an app to get this kind of stuff. Now, as I say, the big thing with this is think small, have something you can carry with you and use at all times. Much like the things, you don't want to lose it, so have set places for it, either in this pocket or on this part of your desk in this room, and try to check it at regular times. A reminder is only useful if you remember to look at it. So try to have it available for you. Try to check it at least twice a day, first thing in the morning or before you go to bed, or ideally whenever you sit down to eat. Just open up and look at your calendar. What else do I have to do? What's on my to-do list? I'll briefly talk about, I used to really make a big difference between doing paper and electronic ones, the advantages, the disadvantages. I'm just going to whip through these very quickly. The big things about paper and electronic is that paper is something that most people are not going to have the problem of easy to learn. Older adults, people in their 60s and 70s, even new modern smartphones are not such a problem anymore. Electronic phones, though, they're still pretty expensive. If you drop them, they can break. Where you drop a pad of paper, it's nowhere a problem. They can be expensive to replace. However, I'm well aware that a planner organizer is limited in how many things it can do, how much it can hold. Phones, iPods, Blackberries, anything like that, they essentially have unlimited space for things like this. They'll fill up with music or photos and things like this. But if you're using it for these kinds of things, memory reminders, it's not going to be a problem. And electronic things can help you. You can take a picture and write a note with it. You can write or put in reminders, and it still works as a phone as well. So use what's best for you, but each one can be very helpful. So the last thing I want to say, I just want to emphasize again, all these strategies that I talked about, they're really workaround. They're compensation techniques. These are not things that are specifically going to improve your memory function itself if you're having memory problems. But what they will do is help you work around those everyday memory problems that you have. One of my supervisors used to always use the analogy of eyeglasses. She would say, I wear eyeglasses, she wears eyeglasses. I don't have very good vision, but when I put on my glasses, I can see as if I have good vision. I can function as if my vision is perfectly fine. My eyes haven't changed, but my ability to work in the world is improved and the same as somebody that doesn't have vision problems. That's the idea behind these techniques as well. They're workaround, compensatory strategies so that your memory may not change, but your ability to deal with it and how it affects your life will. And you can function well and not need help and not have problems nearly as much if you can get these techniques to work in your life. And again, not everything is perfect for everybody. There's a lot of techniques. Most people only really want or need a few of them, so choose what works best for you. And as we finish off here and go on to questions, I just want a couple of acknowledgments. Dr. Angela Troyer and Dr. Kelly Murphy are also neuropsychologists. They do a lot of work still in the Baker Center on memory and memory strategy techniques. They have a couple different programs out there that they run on a regular basis. Their website has a lot of information. It's geared mostly towards older adults, but the techniques and things they talk about are applicable for anybody that's having memory problems. And last, as Jeremy mentioned, it's Epilepsy Awareness Month, and so please don't forget about Purple Day for Epilepsy coming up on March 26th. You can go to purpleday.org or the Epilepsy Support Center website to get more information about this. I hope that everyone has a chance to go around and wear purple for epilepsy on March 26th. So thanks for your time. Sorry I went so far over. I'm going to open it up to questions now. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'm going to ask them to just go ahead and type them right in the chat box there. Try to answer them as best as we can. And since nobody else can see them, I will read the questions out loud as they come in. No questions then?
I'm guessing that you possibly did such a good job covering that people wanted to know that no one has any specific questions for you.
Or I overwhelmed them with my speed of talking. Sorry about that. I realized as I got about halfway through that, oh boy, I have a lot more information than I can fit into 45 minutes. Sorry about that.
It's totally okay. All right, well, we're really grateful for Dr. Brent Hayman-Abello giving us his wonderful expertise and insight today in the fascinating world of memory. As we all know, the human brain is an incredible computer, and there's so much going on in there and so much we're learning every day. If people do have follow-up questions, they are always able to send them to us via email. Our email is on the homepage of our website, epilepsysupport.ca, right at the top right corner of the screen. If anyone has any further phone questions, our phone number is right there, 1-866-EPILEPSY. And other than that, we encourage everyone to continue to celebrate epilepsy in March. And we're very thankful for the Sifton Foundation for helping make this webinar possible. And we are looking forward to a number of great webinars coming up in the Year of the Brain, as well as the Brain Fair coming up April 1st from 4 to 8 p.m. at the Children's Museum. And other than that, thank you everyone for your time, and have yourselves a wonderful day.